Hello, it's me, Argonbolt. As you might know, a short while ago I had a series called On Media. While I enjoyed it, and may do some future videos in it still, there are some things, some important things, we need to talk about. This is not a series, each of these are self-contained. For today's inaugural topic, I thought it would be good to cover something very related to art and mechanical design, media, to science and science fiction. That is the curse of the brick gun slop ship problem. As to my background in space warfare and mechanical design, let's say I have something of a varied background. And as to spacecraft, well, you guessed it, mecha overlaps here pretty considerably. Perhaps more interestingly, my love and attention to spacecraft actually almost predates or is basically in line with when I got into mecha. I've been a fan of and academic student of spacecrafts almost far and away before I applied such skills to mecha themselves. My love of science fiction is also what initially led me to mecha on my own, as many of the finest anime science fiction also includes mecha prominently. But there's also, like I said, a lot of genetic overlap between the art and science, mechanics and aesthetic design of machines in space, humanoid machines, and even humanoid machines in space. So today, I thought it would be good to take a look at something I disagree with, a problem which has permeated the design language and settings of Western science fiction for almost 50 years. A certain blocky family of ships we need to talk about, and why we need to talk about them. Now I am going to get pretty critical here. I will say things that piss off people, mostly dumb people. But I want to stress right now, this video is not a review of any of these series or media I mention. Rather, it is an analytical exploration of the history of the science and art, aesthetic, and mechanical design choices of these very often iconic spacecraft, and something that is up with them. I might shower praise onto a design, or criticize it in depth, but don't mistake that for disdain or praise for the entire video game, movie, show, whatever that it came from. With all that out of the way, let's begin. So after putting it off for years, I recently, finally, after a good while, watched The Expanse. Now The Expanse is a series I can fully say, if I was 16 and saw this would be the coolest shit. But unfortunately, I'm no longer quite such. So while previously I would have held it in a quasi-religious aura, as of right now, I am enjoying it as a fun modern installment in the long and storied lineage of TV science fiction. I think it does some things well. I think it uses some shorthands that I think are very useful and justifiable, and worthwhile despite inaccuracies or fudging. And I think there are some thematic and pacing elements that could very much be changed to the show's benefit. And I will now talk about none of that today! No. What I want to bring up is what sat in front of my eyes as I saw this show, namely, a bricky, blocky, fridge-like series of design choices. I rubbed my eyes, looked to a calendar, blew the dust off my Aphex Twin Selected Ambient Works CD and said, wait, it isn't the 90s anymore. In fact, I was right. It hasn't been that for a while. Crazy. So as I stared onwards at these blocky, chunky behemoths, I scratched my head. Something was up. To understand what it is, I do feel I need to retread something quickly here. My issues with design do not come from the place of technical realism. The Expanse is currently the popular cultural crown holder on technical realism. That is to say, what the Expanse shows will pass with the general audience as wondrously, quote, realistic, and having realistic ships. Now, as you might know from my mecha series, realism is not actually an easily measurable simple scale of, well, if it is or not. Realism, as it turns out, is a combination of factors that contribute to the feelings of believability. that audiences desire to feel a grounded connection to fictional media. So as I said in those videos, technical realism, that is, scientific accuracy, is really only one facet. And this is also something I feel is worthy of mentioning again. Do I wish the Expanse ships had radiators? Yes! Is it my main point today? No. But it is one of my points that I will make. Really, if I was a lesser YouTube SF man, I could sit here and ramble on about 10 things the Expanse gets so wrong! Or alternatively, 10 things the Expanse makes realism more cooler or so good. Thankfully, I'm not such a pitiable shit-slinger nor a sycophant. No. Instead, the heart of why I find the Expanse ships fascinating, flawed, and worth talking about is the relationship between pop culture, our imagined futures, the ships that populated those futures, and those ships' relationships to art and science. We will return to the Expanse at the end. I know this might seem a little strange, but to understand really what my point is here, it isn't really just about the Expanse, so I do need to do this next part. I need to show you the tree of lineage that led to this point, and to grow from that tree the fruit of the gift of context. What even is a spaceship, really? How did it become a brick? Why, in many places, is it still a friggin' brick? The first thing you'll notice about the earliest visions of a spaceship is that they are trying to just grasp what this vessel is. In the journey to the moon, the spaceship is a cannon shell, because surely, to leave Earth's surly gravity, it requires a tremendous force, right? And if Martians should invade, then from Mars, them cannon rounds are coming down. As these earliest images predate or are basically in line with the earliest developments of the science of rocketry, they are still a kind of fossilized form of imagination. Through the shorthand of naval ships and cannon shells, we see that a public and artistic conceptualization of the acquaintance with something as now universal as the black familiar bell of a rocket motor doesn't even exist. These stories imagined astral projection for transport to alien worlds, as often as they imagined some sort of space ship. Would it have sails? How long would it take? It's still very nascent. If this is generation -1 and 0, then generation 1 is firmly the sleek, now retro-classical images of Flash Gordon. Of the early days, when despite how evil their first applied use in military ballistics, the iconic tapered curving cone became the de facto manifestation of what our realistic spaceship was. And of course it was, as rocketry provided both in experimentation and in war, the basis of how the general public imagined it should be, as all tests must launch from the Earth. The aerodynamic fins and fuselage of the early machines imprinted itself as the bold yet elegant chariot for our imagined futures. When Tintin would go to the moon in 1950, in our mind's eye, he would not be riding any confounded cannon shells. No, by blue, blistering hurricanes, he would go up in style. A red, sleek, checkerboard rocket. It is then, with some huge irony, that SpaceX in many ways can objectively be said to channel this kind of classic imagery. With their Starship renders and soon, ideally intact, launches, our past future has met our present science. In truth, of course, the most obvious thing is really the same principles of physics apply to any SpaceX ship as they did to the V2s of yesteryear. And as a shared aesthetic, if the fins now also act as solar panels, all the better. However, returning to the past, we find, as all trends do, eventually, what was once novel becomes mundane. And what was once sleek and futuristic eventually seems dated. If there is one competitor in these early generations to the phallic fin ship, it is the equally simple, robust, and direct image, the saucer. Either based on spinning, imagined Nazi superweapons, or simply loved for the kind of universal sleekness they project while hanging in the air, like a frisbee. This ship, which flies on its own strange aerodynamic laws, also made a huge impact. though more from its grace than from any realism. Incidentally, these two shapes would find a meeting place in the final frontier, in the voyages of a ship whose name I don't even need to say. The forward motion of the rocket, the elegant impression of the disk, would come together across a new medium, a new machine brought by science, the television, into the homes of millions of people like never before. What it became was the ideal. All the while, though, reality was getting cold, or hot, burning hot, if you happen to be the rocket engine of a Mercury program launching. The Cold War took all these nascent ballistics of Nazi Germany and then laughed in their face with the scale of what was possible for the US and USSR. Suddenly, shockingly, space seemed insanely close at hand. Yuri Gagarin would be the first life form in the 3.7 billion years of Earth to leave the mother planet, willingly, and soon Americans would be, hold on, what? The moon? What? How? The raw scale of the human effort and achievement would leave some folks, idiots, still to this day in disbelief that such an achievement was possible. The eternal heavenly bodies could be reached by man. How could that be? It simply couldn't, right? I mean, I bet they got this from like a movie or something, right? Like a movie guy, a director, someone famous for special effects, something. 2001: A Space Odyssey was not simply a science fiction film. 2001 did what Jules Verne and H.G. Wells had done. As American audiences sat in theaters in 1968, they stared through a widescreen window. They did not see a movie. They saw the future, their future, in space. And what led us there but the mighty chariots, the orbital sleek space plane, the absolute lunar lander, the Discovery 1. And indeed, if perhaps the Discovery had kept its goddamn radiators, then perhaps the Rocinante would have its own as well. But the Expanse is barely a fraction of 2001's gravitas. This work affected everything. Suddenly a split occurred. The sleek beauty of the Star Trek felt advanced, and the whiz-bang of Flash Gordon seemed campy and fun, but not espousing the spirit of the times. From 2001 emerged something, said split, imagined inside our spacecraft. No longer had they to make the pretenses about atmospheric design, or sleek line work at all, perhaps. In the imagination, while aesthetics was still absolutely important, fundamentally a new robustness emerged. Oh, and then the 1970s happened. Misshapen bastard children of the Discovery gallivanted across the covers of SF. Space 1999 would have its iconic Eagle lander, a design certifiably real to life in its pragmatic design, its layout of RCS, and engines and structure. And fucking Star Wars! It's impossible to go forward without emphasizing that, as haughty and brainy as the ideal SF was in 2001, it was somewhat decried as sterile or boring. People want blood, sex, 1970s baby, cynicism post-Vietnam indigestion, war, stars of war. And as I've mentioned before, Star Wars made initial pretenses towards realism, but the ultimate irony here is that where it would end up is with a food court salad enthusiast named George Lucas. Lucas wanted to tell the kinds of stories he paid tribute to, the adventure serials. Yes, Flash Gordon. So what was he doing in essence? He was telling an old story, but using the ships and mechanical design that appealed to what was hot in the 1970s. And so, all of a sudden, just as with the sleek-finned pointy bits of yesteryear, 2001's grounded technical realism and the highlight and heyday of the space race slowly gave way. New ship designs emerged. Were they realistic? No, but a kind of utilitarian injection occurred. spacecraft warped themselves, became asymmetrical and dynamic. Welcome to the grim space oil rig of the Nostromo. Welcome to the flying grey capitalist refinery brick in space. Crew expendable. Your severance pay will not be issued and does not cover your chest cavity undergoing severance via parasitic xenofauna. And man, welcome to greebles, baby. The 60s invented greebles, but man oh man, the 70s was the decade of the greeble. What is a greeble? Empty hole negative space. Fuck no, slap some details on that boy. Slap some pipes, vents, tubes. This brick's a machine. It's gotta bleed that machine out in the flesh. Now, of course, SF was not absolute. A huge diversity of mechanical design abounded as movies, books, and shows in space did. In particular, some artists like Chris Foss would do their utmost to bring some sort of vibrancy back. But in the mainstream, you can't deny the effect here. Battlestar Galactica, the original, spurred by the popularity of works like Star Wars, and I mean, well, more dynamic than some, you can still visually see what I mean, right?
What a piece of junk!
Well, Japanese audiences got to see a Japanese imperial icon be converted into a new era's galactic traveling space caravan battleship. Americans watched a white alligator brick. Now don't get me wrong, this might sound critical here, but I do love the classic Galactico's design. The model was very well made, but the comparison should highlight the difference in visual direction. Of course, I must remind you, neither of these is actually technically realistic. What had effectively happened was American audiences were given a pretty tough realism, then chewed it down and kind of gummed it into bricks. Then convinced themselves this was way more realistic than, the Yamato in space, while basically being scientifically about the same. Ironically, we can see the fruition of the marriage of these two in Super Dimension Fortress Macross. It's namely a spaceship made out of ships and bricks, and could transform also into a robot. Moving on, that Alien movie did pretty good, but you see there's this weird demented truck driver from Canada. He's kind of obsessed with like the Titanic and shit, but he's got a pretty good idea for the sequel. So it turns out man, I love Sid Mead. I love his work. And to his credit, Sid Mead put absolutely the appropriate amount of love and design into making the Sulaco. However, his early versions are noticeably more abstract and ruggedly obtuse in their geometry while holding on to the signature Mead line work. What Cameron pushed for, and what ultimately ended up as the final design, was the ingredient that would coalesce the problem at hand. The visual metaphor of the gun ship, to embody the kind of militant hoorah attitude of the cocky colonial marines inside it. It was, in a word, perfect. More importantly though, Aliens was just like really cool, like really friggin' cool, and so its influences bled outwards in the games and media that would follow. Now, as you might remember, the Cold War ended in 1991. Suddenly, our future changed again. No longer would our visions of space be contested by communists based on Mars or the Moon. Finally, neoliberal capitalism had ended history. Our future was a whole universe filled with a moderately bureaucratic United States/UN, but in space. Ironically, this ended up screwing over William Cyber Gibson Punk's prospective script for Alien 3. Yes, that one. The mainstay of SF, of mainstream ship design in video games, movies, shows, and so on going forward, with only a few exceptions, would ultimately be the progeny of these influences. The elements: brick, greeble, big shape, ship, gun. Together, they would form the backbone SF would alternate on visually. Now here is my main issue with it. For the most part, it's all pretty arbitrary and unconsidered. What? Hargenbolt, what? Yeah, as much as I love and grew up with a whole lot of these ships. They don't do really anything that interesting. Did the ship and Starship Troopers need to look this way? No. It's not bad, it's fine, it works. It has a reasonably strong silhouette, and the model they made was, exquisitely well done. But outside of these modular engine bits, and the top part that an asteroid can explode, for plot, most of the rest of the ship could pretty be randomly designed and kind of visually do the same job. Let's not pretend technical realism mattered here too much. So, do you want to make your own 90s brick gun slop ship? Follow the on-screen directions. First, look around your house. For a basic core series of shapes, these can be pretty much anything really. Anything with a vaguely appealing angles or combination. Okay, good. Now, shmore them together. Good. Now that that's done, apply some large joining pieces. Massive slabs of illogical hull armor. Big struts. Whatever. Okay, now place weapons seemingly at random. Hilariously oversized turrets that would make the Yamato, the naval one, blush. Now, add spikes. Random spikes. Ooh, what are they for? Who knows? Wi-Fi? Jiffy Pop beams? Social conditioning? Ta-da! You now have made your own brick gun slop ship. General audiences will eat it up, and will be altogether largely forgotten as a design. Hey now, Argable, hold on now. Not every artist is Sid Mead, you know. Not every series has to have some groundbreaking spaceship in it, okay? We can't all be super realistic. And to that I say, absolutely, a good story will elevate an okay design. I still remember in Stargate when the Prometheus was hinted at and shown off, and just going, wow, finally! After friggin' Gould pyramid bastards pushing Earth around, we had our own big cool ship. But in hindsight,
What a piece of junk!
thematically, amazing. Visually, a brick gun slop ship. And likewise, wonderful designs can absolutely be stuck into a weak as hell work. I remember almost every vehicle from Final Fantasy The Spirits Within. And, that ain't an amazing movie, but visually, the Final Fantasy folks are pulling zero punches in the art department. Even evacuation shuttles are just finely designed, everything is. You will also more or less see the same in games, either in reinforcing the status quo, or in working to bend, break, and go beyond it. In the case of Homeworld, it would be the reintegration of Chris Foss's vibrant patterns and more organic curves to forge its own distinctive style. As well, small repeating elements of design and added character. Even the brickiest of the barges is actually kept pretty geometrically succinct by, at the time, very low poly counts. Heaps of visual detail is painted into the pixels to infer vents, doors, weapon bits, and so on. And ultimately, the most iconic ship, the mothership, is so because of its vertical moon shape, making it so un-brick gun slop ship-like. Likewise, if we look at a redo of a design, something I consider tremendously hard to do artistically, new Battlestar Galactica's Galactica is fairly amazing. They took all the strongest parts of the old Galactica, the gator hull, side pods, and so on, curved the hull ever so slightly, impressed it with the details of ridges and armor panels falling away. They actually kind of de-greebled and decreased the average visual detail in several areas, but they ended up with a now iconic design, one that pushed past the brickishness of even its original incarnation. Halo perhaps provides a great visual example here in many ways. While the Pillar of Autumn is certainly geometric, it's largely spared some of the worst of the brick gun slop ship problems by being simple. It feels like an almost Sid Meidian inspired design down to the relative robust and straightforward line work. It still has bits of it, don't get me wrong, but once again the limitations of tech kept the Autumn simple and to the point. Woo boy though, Halo 2's Forward Unto Dawn though, oh baby. Is this one of the guiltiest of them all? Probably. Random geometry, bulk, spikes, greebling. There's also something very ironic in that we were told this is the UNSC ship class that can enter atmosphere. Okay. Oh, and don't forget to pull the ship's giant trigger with your huge Macross space carrier when it transforms into a mecha mode. The Mac cannon being the barrel just kind of seals the deal. I'd say Reach's redesign did wonders to reduce the brick gun slop ship effect, but then it kind of did a Yui and added back these more jagged armor points and these bonkers turrets. What are you shooting out of them? Donkey Kong barrels? Or just fucking Donkey Kong? And Free Space. Oh boy. Now I love Free Space. I really do. It's still easily one of the best space sims out there. It's got great modding, great controls, constantly being updated. But the thing that made it special wasn't really the ships. The McDeal T-Mobile, the Brickules, and who can forget the chicken gun. Chicken gun. Oh yeah, that's right, the chicken gun. You should start to be seeing the pattern pretty heavily at this point. I'm not going on depth on the Eve ships because just saying some of them are so guilty, I think it should visually be stunningly obvious. And now, I really can finally get back to making the point. I mean, really make the point. I want to make something of an alternate example. Now, when I say brick ship, I'm not even really meaning in the pure sense a cube or rectangle. These shapes, on their own, don't make it such. It's a useful language shorthand I've kind of developed, but it's not a literal perfect descriptor of what is a very conceptual problem. To show what I mean, take a look at Legend of the Galactic Heroes. I love Legend of the Galactic Heroes. I really do. But, on the surface, only in relation to its mechanical design, doesn't this seemingly fit the bill? Blocky hulls, gun-like shape, spikes, surely you would want to count this, Argenbolt, right? Nope. See, the thing is, while Brick Gun Slop Ship is the mediocre final dish, you can, as with all cooking, use most of the same final ingredients to make a perfectly good meal. To break it down in order. While yes, the log ships are certainly brick-like in geometry, note how actually geometrically simple they are. There really isn't that much unnecessary geometry. If the hull has any indentations or adjustment, it's either only a moderate reworking of the overall design, or it makes technical sense as a in-universe logic of weapons or engine sections, or both. Carriers are wider with more fighter bays, battleships are narrower, have larger weapon sections proportionally, and so on. Log here has both aesthetic and technical reasoning behind its designs. And unlike in some works where it was applied secondhand, Log's novels had no clear design for the ships in question. So while it came time to make finally a show and to figure out these details, you do get a sense that these ships internally were worked out, and how they would be externally expressing that self was essentially square one with these designs. Are the Imperial ships gun-like? Absolutely, but being vaguely gun-like on its own also actually isn't some big faux pas. Guns can be wondrously sleek and elegant, down to the fact that they are weapons humans must carry. Ergonomics and the continuous lines of barrels and scopes, gas tubes and so on can lend itself really nicely to a spacecraft. The fact the Imperial forces also look like Austrian royalty hunting pistols, it's a boon to the characterization, it's not a negative. And notice that while some greebles and spikes exist, it's all very restrained. Greebles are like a garnish. When you put a little bit of parsley on a steak, oh, that's beautiful. When you drown your ship in unwanted and unneeded detail, it exhausts the eyes and gives no clear sight lines for it to be read. Log here works as a wondrous example of how all the same ingredients can totally be used in a controlled manner to achieve a far more iconic and elegant look. Even George Food Court Lucas knew this much as well. It's partially why, despite being not great stories, the prequel Ships and Machines did sort of achieve an iconic status. independent of the poorer characters of said stories they belong to. And now I do have to wonder, maybe, just maybe, Homeworld's and Legend of the Galactic Heroes ships benefited a lot here from the limitations of the time. Homeworld had to try and run and not tank a mid-ish to late 90s CPU, and log ships had to try to be hand animated by like humans in shifting perspective shots, no less. This shit ain't easy. Newer ships and games, I find, often try unapologetically to just fill in visual detail. It's just greeble overdrive at times because more details, more graphics, cooler ships. The new log redesigns here are kind of criminally guilty of taking logs designs and then brick gun slop shipping them on top by adding pointless neon bullshit. Here, what was once the freedom of a CG model that you could now not have to hand animate has actually become something of a negative because it means that artists feel compelled to over-design. God, like, they look like those ugly World of Warships original SF designs with their terrible shaping and... Oh yeah, well, never mind. Thankfully, it's not a terminal illness, and a lot of SF seems spared. And so, with that, we can now return. So finally, at last, to the Expanse. You can now hopefully start to see a bit of what I meant. I will be breaking these things down aesthetically, and in terms of their design, and a little bit thematically. In terms of story and technicality, that is, applied relative realism, that shows the internal logic to further highlight kind of what I mean with some of these. To start with probably the strongest of the bunch, the Rocinante is fine. Am I bothered by most of the ship being crew space and the engines and fusion fuel propellant being seemingly a tiny fraction internally? Nope. TV and movie ships do this all the time. It isn't necessarily realistic in a technical sense, but as I said, technical realism is not all there is. In terms of the relative realism of the show's world, yeah, they have bullshit super torch drives, and I'm fine with that. Do I still wish it had radiators? Sure. But I digress. The Rossi is otherwise a fun little gunboat. The main issue for me here is more so a large portion of the other main Earth and Mars ships. Now I exclude the Belters, and for good reason. Their main aesthetic of the show of workhorse ships is very much a factory building with some rockets on the bottom. For a faction of loose, industrious space peasants, a very ugly, bulky aesthetic works wonders. They have what they got, and it ain't a lot, but they make it work. Where I feel I notice the brick gun slop ship problem the most, though, is particularly in the ships of Earth and Mars. Already, we have the McDLT tier dropships that are literally a fucking brick. Don't get me wrong, if you started a line for SF fans sick of every fucking dropship being the Pelican from Halo, I would be first in the goddamn line. But this is... it's just a brick. And sometimes it has guns on it. And unless the proto-molecule also changed the laws of aerodynamics as well, I don't see how this wouldn't also fall like a fucking brick. This kind of sucks. But Argenbolt, they have vertical internal decks. And? If you want to get into that internal logic of the Expanse, isn't this a setting filled with like high-powered railguns and PDCs and big torpedoes? You know what helps against that? Kind of angled armor? You know what doesn't? Massive oblique surfaces head-on? It doesn't matter if you're a tank or a super fusion space warship. Angled composite armor always helps. Once more, this is especially obnoxious when certain SF fans parade the Expanse's credentials of realism. I'm not even holding this thing to IRL standards, just the internal standards of the Expanse's own relative realism it is working with. Why does this ship look like this? When I approach these designs from either the relative realism or aesthetic design, I don't see anything great here. I don't see a good technical understanding, and I also don't see a good aesthetic understanding. I don't find it pretty, and I don't find it smart. Why are these turrets assemblies so fucking bulky? Why is the hull a series of chunks? And thematically, how is this an Earth ship? If all you've got is, Argenbolt, look, it's blue! I'm just gonna move right ahead past the Team Fortress 2 logic. And no, Mars is not really much better. The Doniger almost has something going on with its kind of quasi-Soyuz tapered module rocket look. But it completely squanders it by dredging the rest of the design with the same brick gun slop ship attributes. Aesthetically, you just have all this unnecessary visual noise and messy detail. And once again, by the show's own rules, why is your oblique surface now also your torpedo tube launchers? Do Martians enjoy enemy railgun rounds hitting and igniting the missile cells? It's space! Stick the torps anywhere. On Earth, subs needed frontal torpedo tubes because when you fired unguided ass spreads, it was easier to accommodate that. But even World War II surface ships had their torp launchers mounted at the back. And even subs moved their torpedoes aft on many designs once homing and larger sonars became a thing. I could go on, but you see the point. From the realism angle, it doesn't really hold up. And I'm not talking about the stupidity that is the Corvette class. No, Patrick, the Morrigan being a triangular prism doesn't stop it from being a brick. What really hurts here especially is that neither side feels thematically distinctive here either. None of the Earth ships feel Terran. None of the Martian ships feel particularly Martian. The closest thing I can manage to discern in the visual language is Martian ships are supposed to be fewer but more advanced, so maybe the sharper angles sort of say that. Also, once again, if all you can fall back on is the Argenbolt, the Martian ships are red, I'm gonna ignore that. You're kind of losing at that point. If two designs are so blisteringly generic it comes down to color coding, I mean, I could make a haha RTS joke here, except when I think of RTS spaceships, I think of Homeworld, and when I think of the Titan and Higaran, those had wonderfully distinct designs. Even Homeworld 2's streamlined ships didn't rob the Vega and the Higgs ships of that distinction. Functionally, you could easily say that the austerity of the Earthship designs is a thing that the practical Martians use, and you could say the fanciness of the Earthship designs is what made them sleek. You could basically give these ships to either side, and you wouldn't have to change very much. Now, in Mobile Suit Gundam, the Federation and Zeon might have wacky, funky 70s ships, but they're totally distinctive design-wise in terms of their trends. Zeon ships, like the Musai, have an imposing imperial aura, and the Federation has a more contemporary and pragmatic design set that kind of puts them apart, but not without losing some of the embossment of fins and turrets and so on. Hey Argenbolt, that Salamis has frontal torpedo tubes. You said you hate that. Well, funnily enough, the Salamis, a complete jobber of a ship, actually has an angled bow armor section. So ironically, it accidentally has better torpedo arrangements than the Doniger. As a complete coincidence, in fact. I don't know, maybe you just don't like anime. Star Trek established pretty killer set design rules for what Romulan and Klingon and Federation would have and so on. While sharing some design points, if a faction in a show is important, then distinctly, thematically separate it. Aesthetically and mechanically, in art and in the machine. Set them apart, design, characterize them. These ships, these vehicles, are basically an entire character unto themselves. You have nothing to lose by not designing them very well. It's basically as important as giving actors separate costumes and uniforms. Killzone! Yes, Killzone! A game series with a laughably stupid plot and with terrible fucking characters managed to make two insanely distinct and cool-looking designs. The horizontal, jagged, knife-like Helghast ship contrasted against the vertical, that's right, vertically aligned decks, look at that, sword-like ISA cruiser. As another hilarious example from Japanese media, Zone of the Enders, a mecha game. It doesn't even feature spaceships as prominently as a focal point compared to the mecha. And yet, the greatly talented Yoji Shinkawa, I think, managed to come up with two distinctive, expressive ship designs. One of which is just kind of in the background of a few cutscenes and a survival level. But Argenbolt, that isn't as realistic. It's easy to make two expressive factions when you don't have to worry about realism. Okay, you really want to go there? Now it's funny you mention that, because you see, Hideaki Anno, yes, that Anno, happened to work on a little movie called Char's Counterattack. Now it's a Gundam series, but you don't have to worry, it's not really, just don't think about that. Specifically, Anno has a 10 out of 10 record for including wonderfully realistic spacecraft design, really. And he designed the successors to the Salamis and the Musai, the Klop and Rakayum, the Misaka, and the Rulula class ships. And oh my goodness, what is that? What is that there? Propellant tanks? Massive visible propellant tanks? Oh, and tee! Oh my! What is that? What is that right there? Goodness me! Radiators. Precious heat venting radiators. So get out of here with that realism tripe. It is 100% possible to use the limitations of realism in conjunction with considered aesthetic to visibly and distinctively show two factions of a noticeable difference. So, basically, I don't hate the Expanse. I rather enjoy it. What I dislike, rather, is this decades-long, casual, generic trend of the brick gun slop ship and its problem. Because I think, as a work, the Expanse would have had a stronger visual character to the factions at play had it used a less generic and more considered distinctive aesthetic direction. And all of that would have been possible without sacrificing the realism of the show. Now, some people won't care, or won't notice consciously, but their brains will. Characterizing these machines is as vital and important as characterizing the central characters of the narrative. And while other factors that may get more attention, like story and themes, may seem to play a larger part in that, if those machines can build on those themes, express them in their use, in their design, they can, despite not even being real, be the machines that capture the imaginations of people for years to come. Not entirely unlike a hodgepodge jaunty crew on a stolen Martian guncraft.